Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 569. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show, almost all about the war going on in Gaza, just a few stories on Ukraine. So please share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. If you don't already do that, I'm just under 5,000 followers. Help me get to that mark. I'm hoping to do it within the next week. All right, here we go. Starting off with an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 4th. U.S. official admits Ukraine proxy war failing to weaken Russia. A top U.S. official said that Russia has reconstituted nearly all of its military losses in Ukraine. A core objective for the White House's $130 billion proxy war in Ukraine was to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and leave its forces crippled. Speaking at an event hosted by the Center for New American Security, a major pro-war D.C. think tank, Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell lamented that Moscow has quickly recovered from any losses it sustained on the battlefield. We have assessed over the course of the last couple of months that Russia has almost completely reconstituted militarily, he told the audience on Wednesday. The admission by Campbell highlights Washington's failures during the proxy war in Ukraine. After Russia invaded in February of 2022, the U.S. and UK promised President Zelensky that they would provide anything and everything Ukraine needed to win the war and reclaim lost territory. In April of that year, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin explained Washington's overall policy goal in the war, saying, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree it cannot do the kinds of things it has done in invading Ukraine." However, 2 years into the conflict, it is clear that goal remains unachievable. While Austin claims sanctions would devastate the Russian arms industry, Moscow is producing multiple times the number of artillery shells as Ukraine supporters combined. Additionally, Russia has developed new weapons that are devastating the Ukrainian forces. Russian troops have made steady gains in recent months, gradually pushing westward since a major Ukrainian retreat from the stronghold city of Avdiivka in February. Zelensky appears increasingly desperate and has authorized several ill-fated attacks on Russian soil while lowering Ukraine's minimum conscription age to 25. Still, some of Ukrainian officers warn that the move may not make a difference on the battlefield. One officer who served under former Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny said, "There is nothing that can help Ukraine now because there is no serious technologies available to compensate Ukraine for the large mass of troops Russia is likely to hurl at us. We don't have those technologies and the West doesn't have them in sufficient numbers." And there was another officer who even explained that, look, even if we had them, eventually Russia will figure out how to counter it. So it's something that will stave off defeat, but will not ultimately change the outcome of the war. And next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. This is some pretty startling news. Blinken vows Ukraine will become member of NATO. So as it's clear Ukraine is losing this war, our Secretary of State, America's top diplomat, says, well, we're going to make Ukraine a member of NATO. Blinken said in Brussels, alongside the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And he adds here, our purpose of the summit is to help build a bridge to membership and create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We've done a lot of work on that over the last couple of days here in Brussels. A lot more work to be done now and the summit, but we will see, I think, at the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward and its relationship with NATO. Leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was seeking a guarantee from the U.S. that Ukraine wouldn't ever join the alliance, but the Biden administration refused and never seriously engaged with Russia on the issue. Since the invasion was launched, NATO has doubled down on its promise to admit Ukraine eventually, but no clear timeline or assurances have been given since bringing Kiev in now would put the alliance in direct war with Russia. And from the Ukrainian perspective, again, prior to this, the invasion could never happen. The West could have negotiated with Russia. We could have prevented this invasion by just agreeing to Ukrainian neutrality and maybe repositioning some NATO forces from Eastern Europe to, you know, Germany, or just removing some American troops from Europe, some American weapon systems from Europe. That could have really prevented this entire war from happening, and facilitated the Minsk agreements, right? And had the Donbass region of Ukraine return to and become a member of Ukraine with some additional autonomy. And instead of choosing that path, the West refused to negotiate, which led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. And then in April of that year, of course, they had the option, and Russia was willing again to withdraw out of the Donbass, essentially to return to a framework near the Minsk agreement, and at the same time have Ukraine agree to some demilitarization along with neutrality. And the Ukrainians, because they were backed by the Americans and promised by the Brits that we would give them all the weapons they needed to defeat Russia, decided to fight the war. And now Ukraine has lost a substantial amount of territory, and 4 regions so far, but it seems like it may be more, including maybe their entire Black Sea coastline. This is, starting to really fall apart for the Ukrainians. All right, next up here, Russian defense minister warns French counterpart against sending troops to Ukraine. On Wednesday, the Russian defense minister held talks with his French counterpart and warned against France sending troops to Ukraine. This comes after the French president has made several statements about sending troops to Ukraine. We've discussed this at length, and I really hope it's a bluff, but I am not sure yet. All right, so next up here, I have a story. For anybody watching the video here, I don't actually have the article to show because the website that the article is on has so many pop-ups. It just doesn't work with the browser that I have to use with my recording software here. So this is an article in Plus 972 magazine. We've talked about 2 or 3 pieces that they have written since the start of the war in Gaza. They have done a pretty good job. They have several sources within the Israeli military who are willing to talk fairly candidly with them. And I don't want to say that their journalism is above reproach. I'm sure the people could find criticisms, but from what I've seen from the reports I've read, this has been some pretty solid and pretty good reporting. Again, relying heavily on documentations and conversations with members of the Israeli military who are admitting to war crimes to them. So this story is about this AI targeting program called Lavender. And Lavender, I think, is, we probably got pieces of this story when we talked about the gospel and the Israeli assassination factory. And we've known about this for several months and talked about it quite a bit on the show. But Lavender seems to be actually the more nefarious of the 2 AI programming software. And so essentially what this is what what Americans believe the Chinese social credit score is. This is that, except it's lethal, right? Maybe, another way to put it, if you remember Captain America, I think it's the Civil War movie, where the plot is that they're developing this technology who can assess when anyone's a threat and be able to kill them immediately. Well, this is what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians in Gaza. So Lavender, takes a whole bunch of factors, and they include that we believe you're associated with Hamas, or you have these activities that we believe are common among Hamas members, and assigns the Palestinians a score, I believe, on the scale between 1 and 100. And I'm not sure. They had some slides in there. I'm not sure if they were example slides or actual slides. It looked to me like the score number was about 60. But they could change that number, of course, and they said that they did, where they determined that you're a member of Hamas. Now, look, if they were doing this and then conducting a thorough investigation, they were just getting a list from the AI generator and then conducting the typical investigation, that would be one thing. But these names were essentially automatically put onto the kill list if this Lavender AI program determined that, your Hamas compatibility score was too high. And from the reports, from what the Israeli officials who were conducting this program said, they were approving names in 20 seconds, and the only thing that they were checking was that they were male. They didn't even say that they were checking the age. Now, once a name is approved, it gets put on a kill list. And they said 25 to 30, I think 35,000 junior members of Hamas were essentially approved to be put onto these kill lists. And so even the Israeli military says we assess these to be low-level members of Hamas. So because of this, and again, this is all report from Israeli military sources, and I want to say that because this is extremely dark. So because these are low-level members of Hamas, rather than killing them on the battlefield, the Israeli determined the most effective way to deal with them, because they didn't want to use high power, more expensive precision-guided munitions. They wanted to use dumb bombs on less important members of Hamas, was to wait until these lower-level members of Hamas, like regular fighters, would return to their homes, at which point in time they would drop a bomb on the house, even if 15 to 20 civilians were present. And if it was a higher level member of Hamas, they were willing to kill 100 or more civilians. And again, this is explicit Israeli policy. This isn't, accusations against Israel. This is what their policy is. This is what I'm describing to you. And this program was known as Where's Daddy, right? Because this idea of when kids are waiting for daddy to come home, they're saying to mom, where's daddy? Where's daddy? And so when they're doing that, they're, from the perspective of these Israeli soldiers, these kids are basically begging for their own deaths. And so this is why we have, and we reported pretty early on in the conflict here, that there were over 100 Palestinian families that had lost over 100 members in the first couple months of the bombing. That's why that's the case. This is why the ratio between even potential members of Hamas. So even if you assume that every male killed in Gaza has been, every, male above the age of 16, 18 years old in Gaza killed has been a member of Hamas, still 75%, 70% of those killed have to be assumed innocent civilians. These are just women and children. It's because they were willing to kill 20 members of a household if one person they believed was Hamas was there. So this is disturbing enough as is. It's even more disturbing when you consider that this program likely isn't as accurate as the Israelis claim or think it is. And I'm not sure which one is. Maybe they don't care that it's inaccurate and just claim that the accuracy rate. In the article, they claim that the accuracy, they checked in the early part of the war and it was 90%. I highly doubt that's the case. There's a few reasons. We've seen on the ground in Gaza, the Israelis identifying people who are supposed combatants from their drones or things like that, and they will be carrying stits or bite, and those are apparently misidentified as rocket launchers or rifles, and then those people are taken out ordered to be killed. And so if you think about, what are the potential things this program is using to identify people they think are members of Hamas, one of them is probably carrying around arms, and if they're already misidentifying people carrying around just innocuous objects as arms, then there's probably a lot of people getting killed. You really had to think about this even more with the situation in Gaza, right? 2 million people are displaced. Many of these people are living in tents. And so if you're building a makeshift, shelter of any kind, a tent or something like that, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have a tent pole, which is going to be some sort of long, couple foot long stick that if you're carrying it over your shoulder is probably going to look like a rifle or a rocket launcher from the Israeli drone footage that we've seen. And so how many people have been incorrectly labeled as members of Hamas? We also know that the U.S. has deployed Project Maven to the Middle East, and this has only correctly identified targets in 60% of situations. Maven is also an AI targeting software. And so my guess is that the Israeli program isn't that much better than the American program. And also the U.S. has tried to do something like this in the past in Afghanistan, where basically these networking connections to determine who were members of the Taliban. And as Gareth Porter has pointed out and done some fantastic journalism and reporting on, basically what happens is once you start to get things wrong, it just compounds. And so if the initial uh amount of incorrect, like even if you're getting it right 90% of the time initially, then those 10% of wrong entries are going to lead to more and more and more wrong entries, right? It's going to expand on the incorrect problem. So even if it was pretty accurate to start, it may not be accurate later on. Now, it does seem that maybe this program is less heavily used at this point in the war, according to the program. And that's mainly because of a limitation on the number of bombs and targets they could possibly generate. With everybody living in tents and displaced, I guess it's a lot harder to trap them and to determine who's who when they're not returning to the homes that Israel knows they live in. You don't have an address on your tent, right? That this is the situation. And so that's been a limiting factor, and also just the amount of dumb bombs available to Israel to conduct these strikes. So, all right, so I think that's what I have on all the lavender stuff today, although more may come out on that. So I'm guessing this is going to be a frequent topic of conversation on the show for some time to come. All right, next up here, Israel creates kill zones in Gaza where anyone who enters gets shot. This one from Dave DeCamp, March 31st, antiwar.com. Israel has been creating what they call kill zones in the Gaza Strip, in areas where the Israeli military is operating, and anyone who enters gets shot, even if they are unarmed civilians, Haaretz reported on Sunday. The report said that anyone killed in a designated kill zone is labeled a terrorist, even if they never held a gun in their lives, and they are often civilians whose only crime was to cross an invisible line drawn by the IDF. One reservist who was recently in northern Gaza said the feeling we had was that there weren't really rules of engagement there. One source in the IDF told Haaretz that the claim that 9,000 out of 32,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza are terrorists is not valid. In practice, a terrorist is anyone the IDF has killed in the area in which its forces operate, an Israeli reserve officer said. A senior officer in the Israeli Southern Command said it was astonishing to hear the reports after every operation regarding how many terrorists were killed. He added that Hamas fighters don't operate in large groups, saying, "You don't need to be a genius to realize you don't have hundreds or dozens of armed men running through the streets of Khan Yunis or Jabalia fighting the IDF." Another reserve officer who spoke with Haaretz said he was tasked with telling senior IDF officers how many terrorists were killed in operations, and his men carried out, and said no one can determine with certainty who is a terrorist and who was hit after entering the combat zone of an IDF force. The world got a glimpse of the indiscriminate policy when AlJazeera published a video of an Israeli drone killing 4 unarmed men. The video shows the men walking in an open area of Khan Yunis when the drone strike hits them. 2 of the men instantly die, and the other 2 were finished off with the 3rd and 4th missile strike. The last man who was killed was limping and then crawling away in a desperate attempt to flee. A senior IDF officer confirmed to Haaretz that the 4 men were unarmed and that they didn't endanger our forces in the area in which they were walking. The Haaretz report said that the December incident where 3 Israeli hostages were killed by IDF troops in northern Gaza while waving a white flag were also a result of kill zone policy. And there's 2 other things I want to add here. The other ones, those 2 looked like younger men walking on the beach that were gunned down by the Israeli military. You also had to wonder if that was a kill zone and if Al-Shifa was a kill zone. But also think about this. The U.S. and all of its, Western partners and Jordan are airdropping aid all over northern Gaza. And so let's say the IDF has set up a kill zone between you and the aid that the Americans dropped. It's the cheese in the trap. This is literally a sick and demented policy to airdrop aid into Gaza when you know that Israel has these kill zones set up and they're killing anyone who crosses these lines. We've seen several videos come out in recent days of airdrops floating in, people going to get the aid, and then Israeli forces firing on the people getting the aid. and several people have been killed in this way. One horrific video shows, the Israelis wounding and allowing a person to bleed out, and then dogs ravaging the body. It's the situation, the horrors in Gaza, and so much of this is being facilitated by Joe Biden in the U.S. All right, so one of the big stories over the past week has been the killing of 7 workers for the World Central Kitchen. This was a series of 3 airstrikes in which there were 3, there were multiple cars in the convoy from the World Central Kitchen. They arrived at a building and then they left the building. The Israelis said that there was an armed person with the convoy when it arrived at the building, but not when it left the building. And so they decided to carry out an airstrike. After they hit the first car, the wounded were loaded into the second and third car, which continued onward. They were bombed about another half mile down the road. The wounded again loaded into another car, and they were bombed again. And so this was, intentional extermination. And Biden and Netanyahu discussed this, and Biden apparently was upset, although I still think quite a bit of this is theater. I just read before going on air this morning that the Israelis had determined that there were serious mistakes made in this, that 2 officers were dismissed, and a senior commander or general or something was going to get a permanent reprimand. So that's the punishment for killing international aid workers intentionally, including an American. Remember just a couple months ago when the worst thing you could do anywhere in the world was kill an American, and there would be serious consequences for that. Here, we'll see that you could kill an American and the White House will still send you bombs. So Biden spoke on Thursday with Prime Minister Netanyahu about the targeted Israeli killing of 7 workers for the World Central Kitchen. According to a White House readout of the call, Biden took a harsher tone with Netanyahu than before, but it's unclear if the rhetoric will amount to a change in policy of unconditional military support for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The White House said President Biden emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation are unacceptable. He made it clear the need for Israel to announce and implement a series of specific and concrete measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that the U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. Now, I think it's the thing that stood out to me, having read numerous White House statements and how politicians talk about policy. When they talk about arming and funding Israel, that's always referred to as Israeli policy. And so saying that this is going to impact U.S. policy for Gaza, I think is a very clear indication that they are in no way talking about conditioning American aid to Israel still. So after the call, the Israeli cabinet approved steps to allow more aid into Gaza, including the opening of another border crossing, including Israel's port of Adad as a hub for humanitarian supplies. The White House welcomed the steps and said they should be implemented immediately. Now, one thing to be clear about here is there's multiple levels to the problem, and simply opening up another border crossing isn't necessarily going to solve those problems. It may relieve some of the hiccups and current real things that are slowing down the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, but it's going to be nowhere near enough. So I saw this morning that the Israeli military put out an infographic on the amount of aid that reached Gaza in March. And they said, it's up 200% from February. And according to their numbers, Israel is approving 161 trucks to enter Gaza per day, and about 120 trucks per day are actually getting in. In February, that number was as low at points to 50 a week, and I think averaged out to 80 to 90 a week. So what the Israelis are saying isn't necessarily incorrect. The problem is prior to October 7th, there were 500 trucks entering Gaza a day, and that's before there was already a famine and 2 million displaced people, and all the infrastructure of the strip was ravaged. Additionally, there was also commercial goods entering Gaza every day. It wasn't just aid, and now, it's just a trickle of the amount of aid. The Israelis tried to make it out as though the problem was the UN not being able to deliver more aid, but of course that's because of things like the attack on the World Central Kitchen, where if you attack aid groups, they're not going to be able to deliver aid. That the Israelis have said that they're not going to improve any UNRWA, the main UN aid agency for Palestinians, to ship any aid to the northern half of the Gaza Strip. And so this isn't a solution or really a step in the right direction. There's so many other things Israel would need to do. What the White House should pressure to do is get Israel to commit to allowing in 1,000 or more aid trucks a day at this point. That would maybe be a real step in the right direction. It's unclear at this point if the steps will bring much relief to the Palestinians in Gaza, since many aid groups suspended operation after the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers. U.S. officials also didn't spell out what other steps they wanted Israel to take, and didn't say what the consequences would be if Israel didn't follow through. I'm not going to preview any potential policy decisions coming forward, White House National Security Council person John Kirby told reporters. He also said that Biden has been clear that Israel is a friend and a partner, and that has been true throughout his entire political career, and that's not going to change. The White House readout of the Biden-Netanyahu call said Biden underscored the need for a, quote, immediate ceasefire, but the readout suggested that the type of ceasefire he was talking about was linked to a hostage deal, and U.S. officials have made this more clear since. So, this isn't, I guess, like Biden did absolutely nothing about the World Central Kitchen employees being killed, but this is the minimum that he could do without ramping up the political pressure on him in the U.S. too high. Now, while this went on, we also have this: U.S. approves transfer of thousands of more bombs for Israel. So again, if you're really concerned about somebody, maybe, like if a serial killer and they've already killed a bunch of people and you're concerned about them killing more people, you probably won't give them a gun or bullets. But this is what the Biden administration is doing, suggesting that he's really not concerned about the death of Palestinians. This is Dave DeCamp. The Biden administration approved another weapons package for Israel this week that includes thousands of bombs as the U.S. aid continues to flow unimpeded to support the slaughter of Palestinians. The Biden administration told Reuters that the arms shipment includes 1,000 MK 82 500-pound bombs, more than 1,000 small diameter bombs, and fuses for MK-80 bombs. The bombs will be delivered by the end of the year. The bombs were approved on Monday, the same day Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Syria and killed aid workers that were employed by the World Central Kitchen. The 7 WCK workers, including an American citizen, were killed by 3 Israeli missile strikes while traveling a route pre-approved by the Israeli military. Last week, Biden approved new munition shipments to Israel, including 2,000-pound bombs and F-35s, a deal worth $2.5 million. He is expected to approve another major arms sale that includes 50 F-15 fighter jets that will be worth $18 billion. So, just horrific. All right. Next up here, this one I wrote for antiwar.com at the end of last week. State Department says parts of Gaza likely experiencing famine. A State Department official said there was a significant risk of mass starvation throughout Gaza, and that some regions of the Strip are quite possibly already in a state of famine. Millions of Palestinians are on the brink of starvation as a result of Israel's brutal 6-month military assault and blockade on aid entering the Strip. Speaking with Reuters, an unnamed State Department official said, "While we can say with confidence that a famine is a significant risk in the south and center but not present in the north, it is both a risk and quite possibly present, at least in some areas." The official assessment matches a warning put out by the International Watchdog on Starvation. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, released a new report. This was about 2 weeks ago now, predicting famine in Gaza will begin within the next 2 months. For famine to be declared, at least 2 per 10,000 people must be dying of deprivation per day. So if you think about this, in northern Gaza, I've seen estimates there's anywhere between 3 and 500,000 Palestinians still there. So this would mean between 60 and 100 Palestinians are starving to death every day. And obviously, this is something that isn't going to go from 0 to 60 or 100 over the course of a day or a week, but likely is going to tick up over the course of weeks, if not months. And so if we're already at 60 people are, maybe they're talking about smaller pockets, even 50,000, that would be 10 people dying a day of deprivation. That likely means that over the past 2 weeks in that pocket of people, you've had a few dozen, maybe a few score people already succumb to deprivation. And so this is just a huge number of people facing a major catastrophe. So according to the IPC report, the latest evidence confirms that famine is imminent in northern governance of the Gaza Strip and projected to occur anytime between mid-March and May of 2024. The entire population in the Gaza Strip, 2.23 million, is facing high levels of acute food insecurity. This includes half of the population in IPC phase 5, which is a catastrophe, an increase of 530,000 people, 92% from the previous analysis. The starvation is worse in northern Gaza, where hundreds of thousands are struggling to survive. On Sunday, the UN Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, announced that Tel Aviv would not allow shipments of food or other assistance into the area. Human rights groups have labeled the famine in Gaza as a manufactured crisis caused by the Israeli war and tight restrictions on aid. In a report earlier this month, Oxfam blasted Tel Aviv for restricting aid deliveries and medical supplies. The report said, Israel's policies and practices continue to systematically and deliberately block and undermine any meaningful humanitarian response. Israel's control of Gaza continues to be characterized by deliberate restrictive actions that have led to a severe and systemic dysfunction in the delivery of aid. Israel has taken several steps to prevent aid from entering Gaza, including an onerous inspection regime that creates massive delays. Additionally, Israeli forces have tapped aid shipments and the police officers escorting supplies throughout Gaza. On top of this, Israel has really restricted the visas of aid workers trying to get into Gaza, and so there's not a whole lot of international aid workers there now to distribute the aid. On Thursday, the International Court of Justice, that's the ICJ, stated that the spread of famine and starvation in the Gaza Strip was a result of Israel's extensive restrictions on aid entry and distribution of humanitarian aid and commercial goods. The court ordered Tel Aviv to allow the supplies into the territory unhindered and in full cooperation with the United Nations, prohibiting any action that would obstruct the deliveries. The ICJ notes that a March 15th report from UNICEF found that 31% of children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza suffer from acute malnutrition, a staggering escalation of 15.6% from 15.6% in January. So almost doubled in that time. The UNICEF report also warned that malnutrition among children is spreading fast and reaching devastating and unprecedented levels in the Gaza Strip due to wide-reaching impacts of the war and ongoing restrictions on aid delivery. Aid groups have explained that without an end to relentless daily bombings, they will be unable to prevent the famine from getting worse. At least 15 people started it during the first week in March. In a desperate attempt to reduce the suffering of Palestinians without altering its unfettered support for Israel, the U.S. has attempted to airdrop aid into Gaza. However, several of those drops have been botched, resulting in at least 17 Palestinian deaths, including 12 people who drowned while attempting to retrieve aid dropped into the sea. And now I saw some people, kind of almost making fun of the Palestinians are being very callous about those 12 people who died, saying, well, if you were not a very good swimmer, why did you go out there? Or, things like that. And my understanding is a couple things happen. One, if you're facing starvation, deprivation, swimming's a pretty taxing activity. And so some people may not have realized how exhausting it would be. They're also swimming into the sea. But the other thing that I understood happened is that these aid crates, have tarps and parachutes and all this, and in the sea, all that is sloshing around. And so as you're trying to get the aid off of the pallets that are in the sea, some people got caught up in the parachutes or tarps or things like that. And with the sea, you get rolled up in there, and that's how they ended up drowning. So really just absolutely horrific what's happening. All right, next up here, Hamas says it's sticking to demand for a permanent ceasefire. I just want to include this on today's show real quick because the Biden administration was kind of making a lot of noise about saying they demanded an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but really what they're sticking with is their policy is they want the ceasefire to come through a hostage deal, and Hamas is saying that they're only willing to do it if it's a permanent ceasefire and includes the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, and the Israelis have made it clear that they're unwilling to do that. Next up, Israeli siege causes sharp rise in newborn baby deaths in Gaza. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, April 2nd. The WHO said on Tuesday that newborn baby mortality rates are rising sharply in the Gaza Strip due to the U.S.-backed Israeli bombing campaign and starvation blockade. This is WHO spokeswoman Margaret Harris. From different doctors, particularly in the maternity hospitals, they're reporting that they're seeing a rise in children born with low birth rates and just not surviving the neonatal period because they are born too small. Harris said the WHO doesn't have any precise statistics on the newborn mortality rate due to the devastation in Gaza and Israel's attack on hospitals. The Israeli military recently withdrew from the Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza after a 15-day siege, leaving the buildings completely destroyed and a pile of dead bodies in the wake. And many of those bodies, by the way, were like half buried under the rubble and had been run over by tanks or other military equipment and were just desecrated in the most, in a way that Americans would never even like think to treat an animal, is how the Israeli soldiers are treating these Palestinians. Doctors in Gaza have said that they are also seeing a rise in women losing their pregnancy and stillborn births due to malnutrition and a lack of clean drinking water. This was reported by NBC News that they talked to a 22-year-old Palestinian woman who said, "The doctors told me malnutrition had a big role in this. I was not able to eat properly. I did not take vitamins. There was nothing available. The water was polluted. I was feeling it." According to the UN Population Fund, there are about 155,000 pregnant women and new mothers who are struggling to survive in Gaza. For the 5,500 who will give birth in the coming month, assessing adequate health care is an unmitigated challenge. There are 3 maternity hospitals that in the Gaza Strip, and they are overwhelmed with patients. Doctors and midwives desperate for medical supplies are struggling to provide adequate care, and the doctors who are working in Gaza have lamented that Israel is not allowing maternity kits into Gaza. And additionally, I've read horror stories about women who were unable to get to any kind of hospital and had to give birth, on the street, in a toilet, and at times to stillborn babies. I can't imagine, the trauma that these women are going through and what that must be like. All right, next up here, this one from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, April 4th. Israel killed 100 plus civilians in apparent war crime, according to Human Rights Watch. A deadly Israeli airstrike on a 6-story apartment block early in the Gaza war likely constituted a war crime, human rights group Human Rights Watch has reported, citing interviews with witnesses, satellite imagery, and photo and video evidence. More than 100 non-combatants were killed in the bombing, over half of them children. The October 31st strike targeted a residential complex known as the Engineers Building in central Gaza, situated along the Salah al-Din highway, bisecting the territory. According to witnesses, the attack, the Israeli air raid came without warning, with at least 4 munitions hitting the building in a matter of seconds, leaving it completely demolished. Human Rights Watch found no evidence of a military target in the vicinity of the building at the time of the Israeli attack, making the strike unlawful indiscriminate under the laws of war. Israeli authorities have provided no justification for the attack, the humanitarian org said in a detailed press release on Thursday. At least 106 civilians were killed in the strike, including 54 children. Many of those residing in the buildings had fled violence elsewhere in Gaza amid a months-long onslaught by the Israeli forces. Human Rights Watch later confirmed that the identities of the 106 victims, though local emergencies crews claimed that the death toll may exceed 140. Recounting the incidents, two witnesses said their two children and a nephew were playing football outside during the air raid, but they were unable to save them. The back of his head was cracked open. One of his legs seemed barely connected to parts of his body, and parts of his face were burned, but he seemed to be alive. We freed him in seconds, but he died in the ambulance. We buried him the same day. One man said of his 11-year-old son, who was found buried under the rubble. All three boys were killed in the attack. To date, the Israeli government has offered no public comment on the attack and has declined to respond to questions. Based on satellite imagery, 35 photos, and dozens of videos depicting the aftermath of the attack, as well as interviews with 16 witnesses and relatives of those killed, Human Rights Watch concluded the Halloween strike likely violated humanitarian laws of war. The absence of a military objective would render the attack on the engineers' building unlawfully deliberate or indiscriminate, the group said. Even if the presence of a valid military target would raise issues about the attack being disproportionate, given the visible and expected presence of a large number of civilian casualties around the building. The October 31st bombing is merely one of hundreds of similar strikes on large civilian structures in Gaza, dubbed power targets by the Israeli military, which reportedly aim to inflict civilian pressure on Palestinian society, a practice barred under international law as a form of collective punishment. Human Rights Watch went on to urge foreign governments to suspend arm transfers to Israel and to back international investigations into Israel's conduct and impose targeted sanctions on officials responsible for violations of the laws of war. All right, next up here, U.S. increased intelligence sharing with Israel to unprecedented levels after October 7th. This one from Dave DeCamp on April 1st, antiwar.com. The U.S. increased intelligence sharing with Israel to unprecedented levels under a secret memorandum issued in the wake of October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the Wall Street Journal reported on Sunday. The U.S. intelligence sharing and weapons shipments have supported Israel and facilitated Israel's destruction in Gaza and mass killings of civilians. We are experiencing unprecedented levels of intelligence coordination, Israeli military spokesperson Daniel Hagari said last week. The journal reports that there are growing concerns in Washington about the intelligence sharing with Israel, since there is very little oversight to see if it's being used in strikes that kill civilians. This is from Representative Jason Crow. He's a huge hawk and a Democrat from Colorado. What I am concerned about is making sure our intelligence sharing is consistent with our values and our national security interests. And he is worried what we are sharing right now isn't advancing our interest. And you do have to wonder if any of this is being plugged into the gospel or Lavender AI programs. This information is being used to target the Palestinians in that way. All right, next up here, U.S. Congressman suggests destroying Gaza like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Representative Tim Walberg, he's a Republican from Michigan, has come under fire for saying Gaza should be handled like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, suggesting that he was calling for a nuclear bomb to be dropped on the strip, which could kill millions of Palestinians. Walberg made the comments at a town hall last week when asked about the U.S. funding construction for a port in Gaza, supposedly to bring more aid. He said, "We shouldn't be spending a dime on humanitarian aid. We should be like Nagasaki and Hiroshima, get it over with quick." And this is particularly disturbing because there have been Israeli politicians that have said similar things as well. So you really hope that this isn't the case. All right, next up here, I wrote this one for antiwar.com on March 29th. Pro-Palestinian protesters disrupt major Biden campaign event. So pro-Palestinian activists surrounded the Radio City Music Hall in New York City as President Joe Biden hosted one of the most prominent campaign events featuring his two Democratic predecessors inside the hall. Protesters disrupted the speech, criticizing Biden's unyielding support for Israel. Thursday night's event raised a record-setting $26 million for the president and featured celebrities such as Stephen Colbert and Lizzo. In a footage from the venue, a female protester interrupts the president, shouting, "Shame on you, Joe Biden. You are funding genocide in Gaza," before being forcibly removed from the theater. At least two other instances of protesters denouncing Biden took place at the Radio City Music Hall, one saying, "Palestinians are dying right now because of your actions," as another held up a Palestinian flag. Outside the City of New York deployed scores of police officers to the streets, where hundreds of pro-Palestinian protesters gathered and chanted, "Genocide Joe has to go." There was some pushing between activists, police, and pro-Israeli demonstrators. Anti-war protests have become increasingly common at political events across the country as Israel's bombardment in Gaza nears its 6th month. President Biden has been confronted by protesters calling him Genocide Joe at least a dozen times. Additionally, top American officials and other elected politicians have faced similar charges from constituents who are opposed to U.S. funding and military support for Israel. Washington is Tel Aviv's most important backer, supplying $3.8 billion in military aid every year, while providing 70% of the country's arms imports. As the Israeli Defense Forces (IDF) use a strategy in Gaza that has relied heavily on munitions, Tel Aviv has become more dependent on the U.S. for the bombs and shells needed to continue its war in the Strip. Still, the White House has refused to use any of its significant leverage to press Israel to allow more aid or even end the military campaign in Gaza. While American provided weapons, Israel has worked to utterly destroy Gaza, with at least now 33,000 dead, most of the infrastructure destroyed, and more than 1 million Palestinians on the brink of famine. Next up, a little bit more on the protests and disagreement here. Nearly 50,000 people in Wisconsin cast protest vote against Gaza slaughter in Democratic primaries. So this was in the Wisconsin Democrat primary, and the 48,000 votes accounted for 8.3% of the primary, far exceeding the organizers' goal of 20,000, which was the margin between Biden and Trump during the 2020 election. In Connecticut, over 7,000 people cast votes for uncommitted, accounting for 11.4% of the primary. And in Rhode Island, it was 15% of people who voted uncommitted. So this is a growing trend, and hopefully it's putting some pressure on the White House, but I have my doubts that they really care. Next up here, active duty airmen on White House hunger strike against starvation of children in Gaza. This one by Gary Coden. We reprinted at antiwar.com. An active duty Air Force airman is on a hunger strike in front of the White House in solidarity with the children of Gaza who are being deliberately starved to death. Larry Hebert, senior airman with 6 years in the Air Force, began his hunger strike at the White House on Easter Sunday. He said he will be present at the White House from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on April 1st through 6th, and then move over to the House of Representatives beginning on Monday, April 8th, when Congress is back in session. Airman Hebert, who has recently joined the organization Veterans for Peace, say was inspired by the self-immolation of active duty airman Aaron Bushnell. And so again, hopefully this is something that will raise more awareness about what's going on here. Two quick more stories on the situation in Israel here. Israeli Knesset passes law allowing government to ban AlJazeera. And this is just important to point out because of how much the Israeli supporters love to point out and talk about all the time how this is the only democracy in the Middle East, and what are you going to do, support dictatorships and things like that. Well, here's an example of Israel, acting in a way that the Americans, certainly against our values. And then this one by Will Porter, U.S. loosens sanctions on violent settlers. So the U.S. has placed some sanctions on violent settlers in the West Bank. It's important to remember that well over 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, as well as the 33,000 plus that have been killed in Gaza. But the U.S. has placed some sanctions on some settlers responsible for the violence. Unfortunately, we basically just said that it's really not going to matter unless these people try to travel to the U.S. Nothing's going to happen. And this was meant to appease the Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who the U.S. will denounce as a extremist, and then again just cave into his demands. All right, last up here today, Israeli embassies around the world put on high alert over potential Iran retaliation. So on the last show, I talked about the the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy consulate building in Damascus, Syria, and Israel is now expecting a response. I think Israel is hoping that response draws America into the war with Iran, which will probably eliminate any potential of anyone in the U.S. cutting aid to Israel, even if they carry out just an explicit genocide of the Palestinians. And so I think it's possible that something happens over the weekend with this. So I just wanted to raise the issue. And that said, usually I am, whenever anything happens with Iran, I always remind people Iran is typically on the slower end to respond. They're very tactical in how they respond. They don't want to see major escalations. And I think all that is true, but I do think we're going to see a bigger response from Iran than normal. And I think Israel will strike back. So it could happen soon. Maybe Iran will see some value in not striking back, but continuing to repeat threats for some time. Maybe they feel that this will force Israel to not start the operations in Rafah, right? If you're going to have to fight Iran or be ready for an Iranian attack, you might not want to commit additional military resources to Rafah, be caught up, with many troops in Rafah as you are attacking Iran at the same time. And, we see Israel removing staff from their embassies around the world, putting, removing the weekend leave for some of their troops. And this isn't going to be sustainable over the long term for Israel. And it's going to, have repercussions. And so maybe Iran's going to evaluate, at least for some period of time, it's actually better just to have the threat of violence out there than actually doing anything violent. But I do think we're going to see a pretty large response from Iran. And I think we're going to see it in somewhat of a short term. I think it's going to be more significant than, say, the response to the assassination of Soleimani, where they, telegraphed the hit on the base housing U.S. soldiers in Iraq so that no Americans were killed. I don't think it's going to be something like that. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more next week.